You're listening to Mystical Science, the show that reveals the mysteries of the universe, so listeners can live more consciously connected.
Hello, everybody. This is Karen Elkins. The show is Mystical Science, and today our guest is Gregg Braden. We're talking about emerging a new human story. And here's something that I would like to, before I introduce Gregg, but most of you probably already know, I want to look at the idea of all of the books he's done. I'm going to introduce him this way, and then I'll do the bio part. We are living in a divine matrix. We are all made of the same star stuff. And within the web, which is a woven of light, it's a holographic construct which gives us fractal time. Life is about cycles and spins and repeating matters, which brings us to our repeating patterns as well as climate cycles versus climate change. There are deep truths that are unraveling about our origins, our history, our destiny, and a battle about the story and the old stories of old and what we're going to continue to tell or not. And within us is a mystical God code, which is part of our human design. Gregg reminds us that there is also a secret lost mode of prayer for these challenging times, guiding us to the resilience of the heart with the power to thrive. And we're going to kind of walk into between two worlds after I tell you a little bit about Gregg. But how'd you like that, Gregg? Have you ever had anybody do that with you?
Karen, thank you for inviting me here today. I'm thrilled. No one has ever, there's a song in what you did. There's a song in there somewhere.
I'll email it to you.
I love what you just did. Thank you for weaving my life's literary history together in a few sentences like that.
I know, it's not bad, is it?
Yeah, it's awesome.
So Gregg is a 5-time New York bestselling author, researcher, educator, lecturer, scientist, and internationally renowned pioneer at bridging modern science, spirituality, and human potential. His credits reach for 15 film credits, 12 award-winning books. He's been translated to 40 languages. He's presented in 30 countries, 6 continents, to the United Nations, Fortune 500 companies, and even the military. Well, that's an interesting one.
Yeah, that was interesting.
Okay, just out of curiosity, tell me about that.
I was invited to speak at the United States Air Force Medical Training Center in San Antonio, Texas. And it was the first time I walked into a room. It was a mandatory class. There were people in the room that weren't too excited about being there initially.
Okay.
And it was the first time I walked in the room. Everybody was wearing exactly the same color. Everybody had Air Force blue on. I was surrounded by a sea of blue. And, everyone learns differently, Karen. And what I know is that there are a lot of preconceived ideas surrounding the kind of work that I offer. There have been attempts to try to pigeonhole me into boxes of genres. Some people, consider this new age or new thought. Some call it visionary science. And the Air Force higher-ups that invited me there wanted me to share the new discoveries of the human body that are based upon peer-reviewed science that are not being taught in the textbooks and in the medical classrooms. And that was what I did. And once we began to engage in a very real, very human level, even the people, there were people, I walked in the room and there were people leaning in the chair with their arms crossed like this, leaning back with this look on their face like, I dare you to teach me something that I don't already know. And once I began sharing the facts of the discoveries, where they came from and what they began to mean, it became a really interesting class. And they actually invited me back and invited me to stay longer that day. So
wow,
it turned out very differently from the way it began.
Were you talking about the DNA?
At that time, some of the DNA discoveries I share now were not known at that time. What I was talking about was the discovery of 40,000 specialized cells in the human heart, the sensory neurites, brain-like cells in the heart that think, feel, remember, and sense independently of the cells in the brain, and the new classes of neurons that have been discovered in the neocortex of the human brain. We thought we knew all there is to know about the human brain, and we're now discovering that we're just beginning to understand the potential of what the brain is all about. So they asked me, they said, why don't we know about these discoveries? And I said, well, Number one, there is a battle unfolding in your life and in my life to maintain what's called the standard model, which is a model that sees us as limited beings of limited potential. And number two, there's money, power, ego, and habit in the educational system that is clinging to an old story. And I've been invited here to share with you some new discoveries.
It's interesting because when we're talking about the heart, and you were something else you were talking about, and was I was listening to, is what is happening with the sun, the magnetic field, how it actually affects us as our body. But we're also in a galactic cycle. So within that, you're talking in walking between two worlds, how the electromagnetic spectrum not only shapes it shapes a lot of reality. The sun affects it. It affects the way our heart even regulates, and
Absolutely.
with the Schumann resonance. So there's all this connection.
Yeah, absolutely, Karen. You know, everyone learns differently, and I am a student of learning myself and learning to become a good listener. Because what I've found is, you said in the intro, I've been blessed with the invitations and the privilege to speak on every continent of the earth, except Antarctica. I've not been to Antarctica yet. And not every nation, but every continent. And that covers a lot of different cultures. And what I found is that different cultures learn differently. They receive information differently. And I'm still a student. I'm learning what words and what approach may I use to touch someone intellectually in a meaningful way that's going to help them think differently about themselves and the way they live in their relationship to their bodies in the world. And because we all learn differently, it's you can't have a canned template presentation that you go on dump on every audience, because it's ineffective to do that. So it boils down to the question, where's the purpose? Why do I do what I do? And the reason is because I love this world. I love the people of this world. And whatever time I have in this world, I hope to share and contribute in some meaningful way that can help us to not just survive, but thrive and navigate through the times that we're living in. So with all that said, everyone does learn differently. I am a systems thinker primarily. So I tend to look at the big picture, but I'm also process oriented. So within the big picture, where do I fit and where do we fit as a global family, and what processes are we undergoing, and how can we intervene? A lot of people are not interested in that big picture. So, and some people are. It just depends on how far you want to go. But what we now know is that our heart, the magnetic field of the human heart, the strongest biomagnetic field in the body, almost 5,000 times stronger than that of the brain, that magnetic field is coupled to the magnetic field of the planet that we live on in a very precise, very powerful way. The first magnetic spike that you see in the field line resonance frequencies happens to be the same frequency that optimizes the communication between the human heart and the human brain, 0.1 hertz. It doesn't end there, because our planet, obviously, as I'm a scientist, I'm a degree geologist, I'm fascinated by this. As a geologist, I know that our planet is influenced by what's happening on the sun 93 million miles away, because there is no one magnetic field in the sun. A lot of people think the sun has a north and south pole. It doesn't. The sun has many, many multiple magnetic fields. And each of those magnetic fields has a north and south pole. And we see those magnetic fields as what we call sunspots from the Earth. And when those magnetic fields go through their reversals and when they ebb and flow, that has a direct influence on what's happening to our planet in terms of energetic cycles, in terms of cooperation, competition. We can link the cycles of war and peace in human history, directly correlating those to the magnetic fields of the sun and the earth. When the fields are strong, we're more cooperative, we're less aggressive, more willing to cooperate and solve our problems. When those fields are weak is typically when we are engaged in conflict. And you can see the rhythms and the cycles. This is what I shared when I was at the United Nations recently with Dr. Bruce Lipton, because it's so real. And we are in a cycle right now where the magnetic fields are weak and weakening. They will peak their weakest point in mid-2020. We are moving in to a time when we are most vulnerable and most susceptible to conflict within our own families, within our own lives, within our places of work, within our nation, and between nations. And it happens to be, I think it's no accident, it also happens to be a very powerful election cycle for the United States as well as other countries. But what I also said at the United Nations is this, is the value of knowing where we are in these cycles. This is the value of the science, is it gives us the opportunity. We're not slaves to these cycles. They don't determine the outcome. They set the stage. And yes, we are vulnerable and susceptible, but when we know of our vulnerability and our susceptibility, we make a conscious effort to become very clear communicators, to give the benefit of a doubt to what someone else is saying, to communicate very, very clearly. And the beauty of this, Karen, is on those cycles of war and peace, the times of the greatest peace have also begun. If you look at when the treaties were signed that ended the First World War, the Second World War, the great wars of the past, they were precisely at the peaks of these cycles as well. So not only are we at the time of the greatest vulnerability, we are also at the time of the greatest potential for peace. And that's with the sun. Now the sun is influenced by forces beyond the sun that move into our galactic center. And this is where our ancestors, the ancients, the Mayans, the Egyptians, the Incans, they had direct knowledge of our relationship to the great central sun and to our location in the cosmos. And you say, how in the world did they know that when we only discovered it in the 20th century? And that's the subject of another interview.
Yeah, that's the sun worship part. Can
well,
they take?
But the point is, it goes on and on. So what I typically do is on a live public stage with a broad general audience, unless someone asks, I begin with our local relationship to our heart, maybe talk about the earth a little bit. But in reality, we are part of a system that extends into the depths of the cosmos that we were birthed into. And when we begin to understand the interconnected nature of those cycles, all of a sudden, things begin to make more sense, Karen. The world doesn't look like it's falling apart at the seams. We recognize that we're in a part of a rare cycle that we haven't been told about. And that's a game changer. It changes everything.
No, it is a game changer. We're going to take a short break here, and we'll be right back. But Gregg, where can they find you? Where's your website?
The best place to find me is at www.greggbraden.com. It's Gregg with two G's, GreggBraden.com.
I was thinking, was he going to add those two G's? Okay, we're going to take a short break, and we'll be right back with you.
Hello, everyone. This is Tonya Dawn Rekla, Executive Director of Superpower Experts, and we want to thank each of you for making Superpower Up the #1 podcast network for personal development and spiritual growth. Because people like you have the courage to say that mindfulness, healthy living, disrupting reality, the pursuit of consciousness, responsible entrepreneurship, and radical parenting matter, we now amass over 1 million downloads monthly in more than 90 countries. Our numbers keep growing because there are far more people willing to live divergently than mass media wants to acknowledge. For you, the change makers, the light bearers, the way showers, we say thank you. If you're ready to take the next step in your evolution, go now to superpowerexperts.com and take the Superpower Quiz. And as Neva Lee Rekla, our youngest podcaster, likes to remind us, remember, we all have superpowers and we can change the world.
Okay, we're back. And this is Karen Elkins. This is Mystical Science, and we're here with Gregg Braden. Gregg, there's one thing, because I think this is where you're talking about the story. Because the narrative that people are painting on the media, trying to create, instead of us applying the wisdom that we are now becoming privy to, I agree with you, this is a game changer.
Yeah.
And without that, and what I'm listening to in the news is constant chatter of division, as opposed to finding our common ground, which is actually a bit disheartening because it's actually being fed on a daily basis.
There's a very dangerous game that is unfolding in the United States of America, as well as this game is spreading to other parts of our world. And it's a game of dividing us among ourselves based upon our fears. It's a game of not only misinformation, which is mistaken information, but disinformation, which is intentionally false information being shared and propagated as propaganda through mainstream media. And what it's done, Karen, people say, well, I'm smart enough to see that. I would recognize that. It's my friends tell me. On the one hand. On the other hand, you look at where the divisions are happening. We're being taught that there's a problem between men and women, and this great divide between men and women. We're being taught there's a problem between the rich and the poor, and between the color of our skin, blacks and the whites, and the Christians and the Muslims. And when I engage my friends in those conversations, they cut right to the core of their deepest emotions and the beliefs. Some of them don't even know they have the beliefs until they're lit up. So here's the problem. Once you divide a nation for a number of years on that basis, the nation is now fractured. All right. And then whatever happens after that will always result in a fractured outcome, because we are so polarized. We're so polarized right now as a nation. It's a very dangerous game. It's a sad game to see, because what I've seen, I've had the benefit, the blessing of traveling throughout this world. This is the 35th year I've done this work in one form or another, live, traveling, books, tours. And what I've seen, Karen, is the people of our world, the people generally are good. People know how to get along. They may not like one another, but I believe that the human family genuinely has a love for one another. I've seen humans that may not like another human instinctually risk their lives to save another human in times of distress and times of tragedy. We love one another. We know how to share vital resources, food, water, energy, medicine. It's a handful of people in positions of power with disparate ideas of what the world should look like. This is where the divide really is coming, and it is being propagated through media. But if it were up to the people, if you pull the media, mainstream media, out of the picture and just talk to people who are living their everyday lives, for the most part, people are doing okay. They know how to get along. They know how to share the planet. But we all want the same thing.
Yeah.
Want a good life for us. If we're blessed with families, I've never had children. I've never been blessed with children, but I'm close to my friends that do, and I want a good world for my friends' children. And we're all looking for that. We don't want to be lied to. We want to understand these deep truths. Who are we? Where do we come from? Why are we here? And what can we accomplish by working together as a human family to further our species? And while people don't use those words at the breakfast table, ultimately, when you talk to people at their jobs, everybody says, yeah, I need to make a living and, support my family, but we like to make our living doing something we feel is meaningful and something that in some way contributes as a cog in the big wheel of this beautiful planet we live on. So we're doing pretty good. It's this division that is being propagated through a false narrative of these issues. And I think, unfortunately, we're going to see this come out stronger especially this next year, before we see any kind of remedy to what's happening.
There's one thing that is near and dear to both my heart and yours is the idea of climate change versus what I'm going to call climate cycles, because you mentioned it, how we're connected with the sun. So what's interesting is even our cells in our body are dancing. You and I are dancing. You dance with the earth. I mean, every part of it is systems within systems within systems. As a system thinker, that would make sense to you. And I know that we're going through a wave within the galactic center, which is also causing this issue that we have with what we call climate change. I'm going to call it climate cycles.
Sure.
And part of it is we're not preparing for it. We're trying to do the blame game, and we're not preparing on any sort of local level to deal with what is actually potentially coming?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting, Karen. It's a very complex topic, and it's a very emotional topic, and even people that tell me they're open-minded are pretty much already entrenched in what they believe about climate. So I'm going to preface what I'm about to say by stating that I'm a geologist, a degree geologist. 1970s, I was looking at climate cycles in the ice cores of Antarctica and Greenland. We definitely need to go clean, green, stop burning fossil fuels. And one of the reasons, Karen, that I know the powers that be, are not really serious about climate is because we have had the technology for over 70 years to create clean, abundant energy to be shared in every home of every family that wants the energy. There are places in the world where people don't want it, and it shouldn't be imposed. But we've had the technology to create clean, green energy, burning zero fossil fuels, zero greenhouse gases for at least 60 to 70 years. We've had that. So because it's not being implemented, that's one of the reasons I know they're not really serious about the solution. As a geologist, what I can say is this: climate change is a fact, so nobody's denying that. We live in a dynamic environment. We do not live in a static environment. Climate, just because the climate shifts from where it was 100 years ago to where it is now, doesn't mean that the Earth is broken. And when we look at the ice core cycles, going back over 420,000 years before present, what we see are precisely the same rise and fall, ebb and flow of climate cycles that we're seeing today. And the reason this is important is because scientists will acknowledge that humans only emerged about 200,000 years ago, which means the Earth was undergoing climate change and climate cycles almost identical to what we're seeing right now before humans ever appeared on the Earth. So what I can say to you as a scientist absolutely is that humans have not caused climate change. That is a narrative that's being shared, and people feel guilty about it. They feel angry, and they feel empowered to destroy other people's property in communities now that they are being told is contributing and making this climate change happen. So we didn't cause it. It has been there for at least 200,000 years before humans ever appeared. Are we contributing? Yes, we are kicking carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. You cannot argue with that. I'm totally on board. We are contributing. We need to go clean, green, stop burning those fossil fuels. But here's the thing. We're being led to believe if we use different kind of light bulbs, drive a smaller car, and do away with entire industries that are going to cause tremendous hardship on the people of the world that can least sustain that hardship, that we're going to stop climate change. And that's very disingenuous because it's not going to stop a natural rhythm, a natural cycle. And one of the things that I find especially the good news is that when we look at the climate cycles of the past and where we are now, we are nowhere near the warmth that we've seen in the past. And what we see is that when the warming happens, it's intense. And we have experienced a relatively intense period of climate change, but it's brief. The warming is brief. And it's what happens after the warming that has always been the problem. And that is the cooling cycle that we are now moving into that we are not prepared for. Because the cooling impacts north of the equator, where most of the landmass of the Earth is located. The greatest amount of Earth's human population is north of the equator. The bulk of our food is grown north or near the equator. And this is what really presents the potential. So if we would stop denying and work together to adapt to what we have known was coming, I mean, the real scientists know this, not the pop scientists that you see on cable network TV. The real scientists, they just don't have a platform from which to share this. What we would do is this. We would harden our power grid. We would bury that power grid so that the ice storms that happen in the Northeast every year don't take out the power for millions of people. We would put a lot of people to work. Think of the jobs that would create. We would stop cutting down trees and ruining forests to make the telephone poles that are going to get broken by the ice and the wind and the hurricanes and the storms every year. That's just one example of where we could begin to adapt. Localized living, localized sources of food, localized sources of commerce rather than centralized forces always do better in times of extremes. And these are the keys, localized living in our time of extremes as we navigate a natural rhythm of climate. So that when I had the opportunity to speak at the United Nations with Dr. Bruce Lipton, we were invited as a team. He as a life scientist, me as an earth scientist, I've got a strong background in life science as well. And we shared the rhythms and the cycles because they asked, they said, what can we expect and how can we prepare as the United Nations for resources and energy and people? What do we need to be looking out for the next 15 years? And this is a part of the message that we shared with them.
Yeah, that goes back to another part. And Gregg's oftentimes been in my magazine, Science to Sage.
A very beautiful, really beautiful magazine, by the way, Karen. It is the single most awesome magazine that makes science so accessible to young people and to people who believe that they cannot access science. I love the way your mind works. You have a beautiful mind.
Thank you.
And an awesome brain that mind works through to create the beautiful images. And I love this magazine so much. So thank you for creating it.
You're welcome. And it's such a joy for me to sit at night and be at peace. And I think what makes it is it's incredibly visual. So I'm one of those dyslexics people that if I'm reading, I won't always remember. But if I see something and it drives into my heart, then I can embody it and remember it. So thank you. Thank you. And with that said, we're going to go back to the idea of the other challenges that we're having relative to our times is the idea of AI. And the reason I say that is because there's a Hopi prophecy that actually, Gregg, is in the last issue that I did with you, which was highlighting your last conference in New Mexico. And it just talks about we have the opportunity to walk right now thinking about the two worlds that we're stepping into. And one has to do with technology, and one has to do with our inner technology and what we're marrying. Do you want to speak to that? Because that, I think, is an interesting sort of crossroads we're at this time.
You know, Karen, we could do an entire program, an entire issue on this very topic, and it's near and dear to my heart. I'm passionate about this. You know, one of the things I've discovered from the indigenous people that I've spent time with the bulk of my adult life, whether it was the Andes of southern Peru or Bolivia, or the time I spent with the Tibetans. I was taking groups for almost 15 years into the Tibetan Plateau, Nepal, India, all through the American Desert Southwest, the Aboriginals of Australia, as different as they are from one another, common themes that run through all of these traditions. And, you know, one of the things I found is that these traditions do not separate science from art, from everyday life. Mm-mm. Think about that. We think of art as a pastime or something that we kind of do on the side from our everyday lives. But here's what the science now is showing us. When we experience something that we appreciate, or sometimes we don't appreciate, but when we see a piece of art, we're in the presence of a sculpture. When we hear the music, whatever that art is, we have a feeling. And that feeling literally is a chemical change within our bodies. What our ancestors found was there were certain ways of creating external objects that could trigger pretty consistent feelings within the internal human body. That is science. If you can consistently create a chemical change in your body, and that change helps you to become a better person, helps you to heal your body, helps you have a better life, that is a science. So we've separated all of that out. Where we are right now is we are at the crossroad, and I do talk about this in some of the conferences, and I've written about this. We're at the crossroad. I actually just did a TV series, Gaia TV. It's called Missing Links. And in season number 3, we touch on this as well. we are at this crossroad where our external technology, the line between our external technology and our inner biology, is becoming a fuzzy line, because we are now inviting that technology into our bodies. We are implanting chips, interfacing those ports on those chips with dendrites on human neurons. We're actually linking the neurons with the chips so that through those chips, we can communicate with a hard drive of a computer using Bluetooth-like technology. We're actually engineering the DNA at the embryo level to create what we, in a moment of time and one individual, feel are desirable characteristics. And these are just examples of what we're doing. And I'm not saying it's right, wrong, good, or bad, Karen, because I'm a scientist. I embrace technology. I think it's a slippery slope.
Oh, I think it's a very slippery slope.
because we are on, here's what the science tells us, is that we are the single most technologically advanced, highly sophisticated form of life known to exist at this moment. Now, I have no doubt beyond our scope of awareness in other worlds, we are going to find even more advanced forms of life. But right now, we're all that we know, officially, scientifically, technically. And what the science is showing is that if we don't use certain attributes, they begin to atrophy, or when those attributes are replaced. And I'm going to give you a perfect example. There are Asian societies right now that have adopted the technology to such a deep level when it comes to relationships. They're replacing human body, flesh to flesh, intimate relationships with digital relationships. And even the sex has become digital. And what is happening in those societies is the birth rate is dropping. Women's fertility rate is dropping. Men, the sperm, the viability of the sperm rate is dropping. And now the mortality rate is greater than the birth rate, and they're losing population. And this is maybe the canary in the coal mine when it comes to where are we with this technology? And for me, the whole point is this: how much of ourselves do we want to give away to the technology? And how can we even answer that question until we know fully what it means to be human, until we fully embrace the potential of what it means to be human?
But Greg, here's the other part that I think is really interesting. We're talking about, and I know we have like 5 minutes, so I got to be really short.
I'm going to tell you, if it's okay right now, I'm going to do a quick text, and this is important. And let's go. I'm going to go. If you want to go to the top of the hour, are you okay with that?
Oh, I'm totally okay with that.
Okay, I'm doing a text right now. We're going to go to the top of the hour, and my next interview, I will begin then.
Okay, because part of, I'll just keep the audience while you're texting.
I'm a fast texter. I just finished.
Okay. I think that the part that's really interesting to me is we look at the electromagnetic spectrum. We talk about what's happening with phones, and it is a microwave. And when you're using the microwave, what people are forgetting is they're putting it next to their pockets, which means they're putting it next to, it's actually sterilizing, and the electromagnetic stuff is causing cancer. So in one sense, it all sounds kind of like, okay, well, I can automate, so I don't have to deal with the challenges of life, or I don't have to deal with the challenges of relationship. It'd be called quote unquote robotic. That is actually freaky. And I think, as you and I have a friend named John and I were talking one time, he goes, and if they're listening, they can actually rewrite the narrative. They can rewrite the story. They can listen with everything. It's crazy.
Well, this is the thing. It's happening so very quickly, and there is a willingness when a technology appears on the market. There is a willingness in the broad general public to embrace that technology without question. The assumption is, if it's there, it must be safe to use.
Yeah.
And we all know cigarettes are a perfect example. 40 years after they were developed, the warnings came out, and people were already dying from those. And we're already seeing the implications of, and I'm not saying cell phones are right, wrong, good, or bad. What the technology clearly shows is that on a mobile phone, there is what's called a plume of electromagnetic information where the cell phone is broadcasting from, and that plume dissipates very quickly with distance. So only 10 centimeters away, that plume drops significantly. But when you hold that technology in contact with your ear and you're on the phone, that plume is moving into the skull, into the tissue, can go into the brain. Or when you're constantly holding a phone in your shirt pocket right over your heart is where most of those pockets are. Or when you're constantly holding it in a pocket next to your reproductive organs or something like that, those signals don't stop where the tissue begins. They're penetrating into the deeper levels. And you have to ask yourselves, as a biological being, delicate biological tissues, every once in a while, I think is probably, it's not going to be a showstopper, but consistent hour after hour, day after day for 12 or 14 or 16 hours a day over a period of time. I think what we're seeing is, whether it's acknowledged in the media or not, we're seeing that there is an impact that many people wish they had known about. And another 20 years from now, maybe these studies will come out with cell phones the way they did with cigarettes after they were out, 40 years. I don't know. So I'm just going to go back. Technology, from my opinion, is never good or bad or right or wrong. It's how it's applied. It's the wisdom, the common sense with which we use to apply that technology. And even the chips in the brain that I'm talking about, I think there is a place where, for example, our beautiful young men and women on the battlefields of Afghanistan and Iraq, when an IED destroys their vehicle and destroys parts of their bodies, to have a chip that allows them to pick up their own glass of water or to comb their own hair or to hold their loved one, what a life-saving, life-altering, powerful technology. And I am all on board with that. But to recreationally install a chip for young people so they can interface with their games, for me, I think has an impact that as a society we need to be aware of.
Oh yeah, that kind of reminds me of and I know you're with the Gaia and you're doing lost archaeology, and goes back to the concept of Atlantis. And a lot of people say we almost had it right, and then we did a few things and blew ourselves up, or the Earth changed. But that goes back to cycles. That goes back to your notion of fractal time and how we repeat patterns until we get them again.
Well, what we see right now, a beautiful example of this. When I was in school in the 1950s, Karen, way back in the 50s, 60s, early 70s, I
are the same age.
Okay, I was taught that civilization began about 5,000 years ago. And when we were studying ancient Sumerian, ancient Egypt, that was the history of the world from then forward. The problem with that is that the archaeology is now telling us new discoveries are revealing civilizations that collapsed when Sumeria began, civilizations that collapsed when Egypt began, and they are now pushing that, they're doubling that date back to at least 10 to 13,000 years before present. And as a geologist, this is interesting to me because the ice age that covered so much of the earth ended right about that time, about 12,000 years before present. So what we're seeing now is the history that you and I were taught as the history of the world. It's not the history of the whole world forever. It's the history of the most recent 5,000-year cycle that, interestingly, the Egyptians knew about, the Mayans knew about, the Incans knew about. It's the most recent 5,000-year cycle. And the new archaeological discoveries all fall within the second oldest 5,000-year cycle. And now we're beginning to we're finding evidence of advanced technological societies that are now 13,000 and beyond on Earth. And there's even evidence of archaeological remnants on the lunar surface that are being dated right around 50,000 years. 2016, NASA was, through Freedom of Information, released all of the photographic images from the lunar missions from the Apollo missions without explanation. They were essentially forced to release them into public access. And very clearly on those images, a lot of our viewers may know this, some may not, we see where we were looking for evidence of biological life. We're looking for microbes and signs of life next to what appear to be massive walls of structures and archaeological remnants of something. And this is fascinating to me because within the context of cycles, what we see here on Earth, Karen, we now have archaeological remnants of technologically advanced civilizations, hot and cold running water, flush toilets, underground sewage, stained glass windows, electricity running in cables under the ground in forms of lighting that we're only beginning to understand. And we see that in 10,000-year-old sites in contested areas in India, for example. And while you don't hear a lot about these, it tells us that we have had this technology in past cycles.
Yeah.
So when we reveal what it is that is on that lunar surface, and a lot of people are going to say, my God, if there's a structure there, it must be aliens, ETs, UFOs, and it very well could be. But I think the odds are better that it's not remnants from another world, but it's remnants of another cycle. When we, as humans, achieved great and beautiful things before we destroyed ourselves through the selfishness of war. And the question is, if that is part of our history, and we're in another cycle where the climate is changing just as it did 5,000 years ago, just as it did 10,000 years ago, where resources are shifting and our ability to grow food just as it has in the past, will we use war to solve our problems this time the way we have in the past? We're answering that question right now through the choices that we're making. And that's the relevance for me of stepping back, looking at the big picture and saying we're part of something much greater than we've been led to believe, and the wisdom of knowing where we are in a cycle and what options we have as we move forward. It's a very different way of thinking. I'll acknowledge that right off the bat.
Oh, no. I think it's essential
healthy.
And it's critical.
It's a healthy way of thinking so that we don't fall into the trap of the mistakes, if you want to call them mistakes, that we've made in the past.
I would like to think that we would like to evolve a little bit better. And that goes back, because we still have a little bit of time, to the idea of the divine matrix. And the matrix is this matrix of light and refraction and story. So telling a better story is absolutely critical because, as you know, and as you teach, what we think and what we do, what we put into the airwaves is really the mirrors of things that are reflecting back.
Well, absolutely. You know, the idea, just the idea that there's a field that connects all things, that idea was, there was a lot of pushback on that idea up until very recently. You know, the late 1800s, scientists were arguing, is there a field that connects all things or not? Is everything separate or is everything connected? And there was a very famous experiment, the Michelson-Morley experiment. It was a good experiment, poorly interpreted.
Yep.
The experiment said that there is no field. For over 100 years, science is based on the idea that everything is separate and what you do in one place has no effect somewhere else. That experiment was repeated by the U.S. Air Force in 1987, and they said, same experiment, better equipment. There is a field out there. It was relegated to these very technical journals. In the year 2012, at the CERN superconducting super collider that straddles the border between Geneva, Switzerland, and France, the basis of that field was acknowledged. It's called the Higgs field. It was theorized by Peter Higgs, who lived to see his theory proven. So now science accepts that there is a field that connects all things, this underlying field of energy. And it plays three very powerful roles in our lives. It's the container within which all things are unfolding in our lives. It's the container. And you think about that. It's the container for all experience, all dimensions are within this container, number one. Number two, as you mentioned, it appears to be a quantum mirror in the world around us for what we simulate in our heart, in our brain, through our thoughts, feelings, emotions, and beliefs, our greatest fears, our greatest loves. From in here, those experiences appear to be mirrored in this stuff, this quantum essence that it permeates our world. And once we begin to understand that, and we see the patterns, and we see how we can change those patterns, it becomes a very, very powerful tool in our toolbox of the evolution you're talking about. And number three, because the field now shows that everything is connected through what's called quantum entanglement. it tells us that we communicate with the field through our heart and our brain in ways that make it very easy for us to influence, not to control or manipulate, but to influence our world. And where this comes in very, very powerfully, I have people ask me this all the time, is with regard to prayer. I've had mothers who have written to me saying, I want to pray for my son who is on the battlefield of Afghanistan. I've got this awesome prayer. How do I get it from my living room to where he is? And they're thinking that somehow this prayer is an entity that has to travel through something to get there. And the beauty of what the new science is telling us is the prayer is already there. When we create that prayer, because of the phenomenon of quantum entanglement, you don't have to worry about making sure it makes the right turns around the right mountain pass and across the ocean. The prayer is already there in the field, because time and space don't mean the same thing in the field that they mean right now in this three-dimensional world. Right. There's a peer-reviewed article that came out in the Journal of Complementary and Alternative Medicine. Beautiful article that said there is now compelling evidence I'm amazed I can remember this whole sentence. There's compelling evidence to suggest that the physical heart is coupled to a field of energy that operates beyond the laws of space and time as we understand them today.
And that I think goes back to even Jesus, that goes back to the Sacred Heart, that goes back to the Heart Sutras. I mean, it goes back to everything that actually, they always said that was the gateway.
Well, it wasn't science. And as a scientist, I'm going to acknowledge that right off the bat, wholeheartedly. It's not science, but they understood us and our relationship to the world in a way that they could apply it meaningfully without having to dissect it and fully understand how it worked. They understand how to apply it. So this all comes back to me, Karen, it all comes back, the bottom line, the better we know ourselves, the better equipped we are to navigate whatever life brings to our doorstep. And because of where we are in the cycles, because we know that we are in a time of vulnerability and susceptibility, but also a time of great power to bring peace to our families and our society and our nations. And now I think it's no accident. The symmetry is so beautiful. It's no accident that at the same time we're discovering these things about the cycles in the field, we're discovering our relationship to that field through our heart and how to embrace it through the most ancient and cherished traditions of our past. Isn't that beautiful? It's all coming together in that way. And
I think this is the time where we make a choice. And thank you for being on the show. I think with that, it's nice to connect. And I'm 12 exactly straight up. You're done.
All right, Karen, I'm finished with this. I'm off to another interview.
I know you are.
Thank you for making the time and your patience with my schedules so that we can have this. We should do this more frequently because I think we've got a lot of ground to cover if you have any openings.
Oh, you can chime in anytime. I love it. So thank you. I mean, I still have all this to go.
All right, well, put that on hold. Have a beautiful rest of the day. And thank you for all the work you do to support the work that I'm doing and beyond. I love you all. Thank you.
Yep. Thanks, Gregg.
Karen. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye. And the way you can find Gregg is greggbraden.com with 2 G's. And with that, we sign off. Thank you. Bye, Gregg.
Bye-bye.
Are you ready to discover your superpowers? Go now to superpowerexperts.com and take the superpower quiz today.